Hi, this is Zach from Worn & Wound, and today I'll be looking at the Seiko Prospex SRPD25, the fourth generation of the Seiko Monster. Seiko's Monster is something of a legend in the enthusiast watch space. With an in-your-face design, big case, and bold use of color, it always stood out from the more traditional divers like Seiko's own SKX007. When I first became acquainted with the Monster, it featured hour markers that resembled shark's teeth that seemed to glow for days, a full metal bezel assembly, and a bright orange dial that was unmistakable from across a room. This was not a watch that was capable of flying under the radar. Today's Monster is something else entirely. It's still a big and somewhat aggressive dive watch, and it still has a ton of wrist presence, but this new version is more refined in a lot of ways. It's slimmer for one, not by an enormous amount, but it's definitely noticeable in how the watch wears and presents itself. And that in-your-face styling is more subdued here. There are fewer hard edges, and the whole thing feels more grown up and less weird. Choosing the old Monster used to mean you were going for something different with a lot of intention. The new version? It's made in a similar spirit to the rest of Seiko's iconic dive watches, like the Tuna and the Turtle. It's distinctive, but maybe not as completely wild as it used to be. There's no question that the Monster's case, and specifically the bezel assembly, is this watch's defining characteristic, and is likely going to be the factor that determines your initial reaction to it when you strap it to your wrist. It's not really like any other watch on the market, but there's actually an ingenious design behind the strange appearance, and it makes the Monster wearable, and in this fourth generation version, actually quite sleek. The so-called shrouded bezel design seen here on the Monster is nothing new for Seiko. They've been keeping dive watch bezels surrounded by thin sheets of titanium, ceramic, and steel since 1975, when the reference 6159-7010, commonly referred to as the grandfather tuna, made its debut. On the Monster, the shroud isn't nearly as pronounced as what you'd see on a vintage Tuna or its many contemporary offspring. The SRPD25 shrouds, there are actually two of them, are basically just extensions of the lugs in the vertical direction. The bezel of the Monster is hidden by that extra height. Another way to think of it is to imagine a traditional dive watch and the bezel resting on top of the case. On the Monster, the bezel is sunk into the case, below the top of the lugs. Regardless of your feelings or preferences as to how this looks, the shrouded bezel design employed here has a few tangible benefits. First, it offers a certain amount of protection to the bezel itself. In order to turn the bezel to time an event, you're essentially forced to grip it at 2 and 8 rather than 12 and 6 or anywhere else. It requires a bit of intentionality to move it, and reduces the risk of the bezel being accidentally jostled during a dive or another high-stress activity. Secondly, and likely much more importantly for the vast majority of us, it helps make a big watch feel a lot slimmer. On a traditional diver, case height can feel exaggerated as a result of bezels that sit high above the mid-case. While there are sometimes good design or technical reasons that require a bezel to be mounted in this way, it can often lead to a watch that's not only bulky visually, but actually feels top-heavy, making it a chore to wear for extended periods of time. That's not a problem with the Monster. Take a look at the watch in profile and you can see that the top of the bezel just barely clears the top of the watch's lugs. You can plainly see how sinking the bezel into the case shaves millimeters off the watch's height. It's not a dramatic difference in terms of the raw numbers, but it has a real impact on the wearing experience. The design of the bezel further slims the watch visually, with a concave sloping toward the center of the dial. This is a small detail, but it has a large impression on the overall shape of the watch and how it wears on the wrist. Think of almost any other watch with a substantial bezel, rotating or not, and consider the shape that it lends the watch as you look at it from the side or a time-telling position. Assuming the bezel is flat, the watch's full thickness is represented across its entire diameter. Here, because of that gentle slope, you'll only feel it at the watch's outermost point. This is all to say that the SRPD25 feels quite a bit leaner than previous versions of this watch, which often felt like blunt instruments. It's still a large case at about 42.5 millimeters in diameter by about 13.5 millimeters in total height, But that's just about half a millimeter smaller in both dimensions than the popular second generation Monster, which is likely what many watch lovers conjure in their mind when they think of this watch. Again, this isn't a substantially thinner or smaller watch, but the easier wearing dimensions and some innovative Seiko design tricks make it feel and look easier to wear than its predecessor. The SRPD25 has a deep blue dial with an iridescent metallic sheen. It plays with light in interesting ways, and the blue is just a really pleasing tone. It never gets so dark that it appears black, but it can go from a deep navy to an almost sky blue depending on how the sun hits it. This new version of the Monster is also available with a black dial, but for my money the blue is way more interesting and more in line with this watch's history of using color in bold ways, although both dial options represent a move toward conservatism in the Monster line. There's no orange here, at least not yet, and the watch feels more grown up as a result. One of the most controversial elements of the new Monster's look is the inclusion of a magnifier over the day-date window. Now, this isn't the first time a Monster has used a cyclops magnifier. It was a feature on the earliest first-gen Monsters nearly 20 years ago. But this is a design element that never fails to divide watch lovers into vocal and diametrically opposed camps. Personally, I tend to be pro-cyclops. On a sports watch, I generally support anything that aids in legibility of the dial at a glance. But a bigger concern for me than the presence of a cyclops is how well it's executed. Some old school magnifiers are glued right on the crystal, and on vintage watches that haven't been properly taken care of, you can sometimes spot adhesive residue with the naked eye right on the crystal. That's not a good look, and neither are magnifiers that aren't very strong, leaving you to wonder why they bothered with the somewhat radical step of adding one in the first place. After spending some time with the SRPD25, I can't really find fault with the implementation of the cyclops here. While I'm not sure how necessary it will be for most, it doesn't feel like an extra part that's been tacked on without a lot of thought. To me, it makes sense in the larger context of this particular watch. The SRPD25 comes in a substantial and well-made Seiko bracelet. It's simple and comfortable and matches the watch's tough and sporty aesthetic. This bracelet has polished center links, but they're small and discreet and add just the right amount of vintage-inspired elegance to the watch's look. The folding clasp is pretty standard. It's stamped, not milled, but it doesn't feel as chintzy as some of the cheapest clasps I've handled. It's helped by a dual trigger that's required to unlock it, so while it doesn't have that satisfying bank vault style locking into place feeling that you see on nicer Swiss divers, I don't have any concerns that the clasp is going to accidentally come undone. This watch also wears really well on rubber. I've tried it on the standard Seiko accordion style dive strap, as well as some thinner third-party rubber straps. The case of the SRPD25 sits close to the wrist, so low-profile straps will work well here. Sometimes with watches that have unusual design characteristics like the Monster, I found that nothing seems to quite fit as well as the bracelet or strap that the watch was designed for. But the more traditional dimensions with this iteration of the Monster invite experimentation, and I think this watch could easily be worn on leather or nylon as well. Regardless of your strap or bracelet choice, this watch wears true to size. While it's slimmed down compared to other Monsters, it's still a big watch by any definition, and it doesn't hide its size. It looks and feels like a 42mm watch, even though it's a totally different experience than previous Monsters. That said, it's not unwieldy, and if you're at all inclined to wear a 42mm watch, you should be able to handle this one easily. When it's all said and done, this Monster really isn't so scary. What was once a watch that was nearly avant-garde in its distinctiveness is now, well, somewhat normal. I have mixed feelings about this. I really enjoy wearing the Monster. This is actually my personal watch, and I decided to buy it after owning a previous generation Monster years ago. The SRPD25 is functional, well-made, and I think it looks great. However, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little nostalgic for the totally off-the-wall design of the original Monster. There's no denying that something that was once head-turning and shocking is now, frankly, a little bit more pedestrian. To put it another way, this might not be a watch that a non-watch person sees and thinks, "Oh my god, what is that?" whereas the Monsters of the past definitely were. Ultimately though, I think that's okay. Seiko still makes watches that are certifiably crazy. The recently reintroduced Arnie is a great example, as are the many different tuna varieties out there in a rainbow of colors, and even the new Seiko 5 Sports series offers watches with genuine flair. So maybe it's just time to retire the nickname. With a new generation of exciting, interesting designs coming up behind it, the Monster doesn't need to be the alternative choice it once was. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up below and subscribe to our channel. For the full review and other great watch content, be sure to visit wornandwound.com.